The room didn't fall silent because someone asked for quiet. It fell silent because a line had been crossed. A respected industry figure had just challenged Michael Jackson publicly, deliberately, and in front of the people who decided careers. Not in an interview, not backstage, not behind closed doors where words could be softened later. This was humiliation disguised as honesty. Michael Jackson was sitting less than 10 feet away when it happened, and for the first time that night, he didn't smile. Because this wasn't about ego, rivalry, or even music. It was about something Michael had been running from his entire life. If he stayed seated, the room would decide he was a fraud, a performer hiding behind spectacle. If he stood up and failed, the world would never let him forget it. What nobody in that room understood was this. Michael Jackson had been preparing for this exact moment for years, not to win, but to survive it. Every rehearsal after everyone else left. Every hotel lobby at 2 in the morning. Every piano played quietly so no one would hear. All of it had been preparation for a moment he hoped would never come. And now it was here, with cameras rolling, reputations on the line, and no script to follow. Because whatever Michael did next wouldn't just define the night. It would define how he would perform for the rest of his life. Los Angeles, 1988. The event wasn't advertised. No tickets were sold. No fans were invited. This was an industry room. Executives who never applauded. Critics who never forgot. Musicians who believed they owned legitimacy. The people who quietly decided who was real and who wasn't. Michael Jackson sat in the front row, perfectly still. On paper, he didn't belong there. Pop stars rarely did. This wasn't a place for spectacle or emotion. It was a place for judgment. Michael had been invited because excluding him would have looked strange, but acceptance didn't mean respect. The tension in the room had been there all night. Whispers behind hands. Side glances held a second too long. Smiles that never reached the eyes. Michael felt it. He always did. Then the microphone changed hands. The man who stepped forward wasn't angry, and he wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the room already agreed with him. "Pop stars don't make real music," he said calmly. A ripple of restrained laughter followed. Michael didn't move. The man continued, pacing slowly, choosing his words carefully. "They sell feelings, they sell spectacle, but musicianship is something else entirely." Still no reaction from Michael. Then came the sentence that froze the room. If Michael Jackson is the genius everyone claims, perhaps he could demonstrate it. Right now. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a test. Cameras rose instinctively, not because this was planned, but because instinct recognized damage. Michael's team felt it immediately. This wasn't safe. If Michael declined, the story would be simple and cruel. Pop star exposed. If he accepted and failed, no amount of fame would repair it. Michael remained seated. Seconds passed. In that space between breaths, the room made its assumption. They assumed he wouldn't stand. They assumed the myth would protect him. They assumed the moment would pass. They assumed wrong. Michael rose slowly. Not defiantly, not dramatically, deliberately. The shift in the room was immediate. This wasn't confidence, it was recognition. People who knew Michael well later said they saw it in his posture. Not anger, not pride, decision. He walked toward the stage. There was a piano there, decorative, cold, slightly out of tune, never meant to be used. Michael sat anyway. No speech, No explanation, just his hands resting on the keys. And in that moment, something changed that no one in the room would understand until much later. The room believed it had just witnessed confidence, control, a pop star rising to a challenge and winning. But what no one in that audience understood was that what they had seen wasn't courage. It was fear finally catching up with him. Because Michael Jackson didn't stand up that night to prove anyone wrong. He stood up because he had spent his entire life preparing for the possibility that someone would one day ask that question out loud in front of people who could take everything away from him with a sentence. Years before the fame, before the screaming crowds, before the records and the myth, Michael learned something very early. Applause fades. Respect doesn't come for free. When Jackson 5 rehearsals ended, Michael didn't go home. He stayed behind in empty studios, quiet hallways, hotel lobbies late at night when the building felt abandoned. There was always a piano somewhere, sometimes out of tune, sometimes missing keys, sometimes barely playable. But it didn't matter. Michael practiced anyway because he wasn't chasing applause. He was chasing safety. He studied music the way some people study survival. Harmony, structure, rhythm, timing, silence. Not because anyone demanded it, and not because it would make him famous. Fame had already found him. He studied because he was terrified of being exposed as someone who didn't belong. Every compliment he received carried a shadow. Every standing ovation came with a question he never asked out loud. What happens when they stop clapping? What happens when the spectacle isn't enough? That fear followed him everywhere. Awards ceremonies where people smiled but whispered. Stadium tours where thousands screamed his name, but a few critics questioned his legitimacy. Magazine covers that celebrated him while quietly doubting him. The bigger Michael became, the more dangerous the doubt felt, because if someone challenged him at the peak, the fall would be absolute. So he kept preparing, quietly, obsessively, long after rehearsals ended, long after producers left. Michael never talked about this part of himself, not to the press. Not even to most of his collaborators, because if people knew, they would expect proof, and Michael didn't want to live in a world where he had to constantly justify his right to be there. He didn't want to be tested, he wanted to be trusted. That night in Los Angeles, when the challenge came, it wasn't unexpected, it was inevitable. Michael didn't stand up because he felt confident. He stood up because the moment he had feared for years had finally arrived. Sitting still would have confirmed every doubt he'd ever heard whispered about him. Standing up was the only way to survive it. After the event, away from the cameras and the applause, someone close to him asked why he did it, why he put himself through that kind of pressure in front of people who were waiting for him to fail. Michael didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was calm, almost empty. "If I don't prove it," he said, "they'll never stop asking." What the world saw as victory felt to Michael like relief mixed with exhaustion, because now the secret was out, even if no one understood what it really meant. The bar had been raised. And it wasn't raised by the critics, the executives, or the audience. It was raised inside him. And Michael knew, even in that moment, that from now on, nothing he did would ever be allowed to be casual again. That night didn't end when Michael left the stage. It followed him, quietly, permanently. From that moment on, something inside Michael Jackson shifted. Not visibly, not in a way the audience could see, but deeply enough to change how he approached everything that came after. The applause that night was loud, but it didn't bring peace. It brought pressure. Because once Michael proved himself in that room, he taught the world something dangerous, that he could always be asked to prove it again. From then on, nothing was allowed to be casual. Rehearsals became longer. Mistakes became unacceptable. Details that others would ignore began to feel unbearable. Michael wasn't chasing perfection for the audience. He was chasing silence. Silence from the voice that told him he would be questioned again. Silence from the fear that the next room might not be as forgiving. People around him noticed the change. Sleep became shorter. Control became tighter. The joy that once lived inside performance slowly turned into responsibility. Each show wasn't just a concert anymore. It was evidence. Every note had to justify his place. Every movement had to defend his legitimacy. Michael wasn't performing to be loved. He was performing to avoid being doubted. Years later, when the pressure had accumulated beyond what anyone should carry, Michael admitted something to a confidant that he never said publicly. "I don't mind people doubting me," he said quietly. "I mind that I believe them." That sentence explained everything. That night in Los Angeles didn't silence his critics. It trained his inner critic to never rest. The tragedy wasn't that Michael rose to the challenge. It was that the challenge never ended. Because once greatness is proven under pressure, it becomes the minimum expectation. The world applauds the result, but it never sees the cost. The cost was a life where rest felt undeserved, where peace felt temporary, where stopping felt like failure. Michael Jackson didn't lose that night. He survived it, but survival came with a price. From that moment on, excellence wasn't a choice. It was a requirement, and requirements don't come with mercy. In the end, that night became a quiet turning point. Not the moment Michael showed the world who he was, but the moment he stopped believing he was allowed to be anything less than perfect. The audience went home inspired. The headlines celebrated a victory, but Michael carried something else with him. A standard he could never lower, a silence he could never reach, and a lesson no one applauds but everyone remembers. That greatness once demanded never gives anything back.